I was 21 the night my parents disowned me. It happened in our cramped living room. The air thick with disappointment and unresolved anger. My father stood rigid by the fireplace, arms crossed, his face set in a grim, familiar mask. My mother lingered near the mantel, adjusting a framed picture of my brother Nate in his Ivy League graduation gown, as though even thinking about me was beneath her. "We've had enough of your reckless behavior, Liam," my father said, his voice tight with disgust. "Quitting your job to start some tech business? It's irresponsible." "It's my life," I shot back. "I've saved enough, done my research. This is real." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Real? You have nothing. No degree, no steady income, no stability. Just pipe dreams." My mother's voice cut through like a blade. "Why can't you be more like Nathan? He's built a career, a future. You—" She broke off, waving a hand dismissively. "You're chasing some fantasy." There it was, the comparison that had haunted me my entire life. Nate, the golden child, with his perfect grades, perfect job, perfect life. I'd always been the shadow, the disappointment they tolerated but never celebrated. "You're going to regret this," I said, voice trembling with anger, but not as much as the shame burning in my chest. "One day, you'll see what I'm capable of." Their only response was silence. I walked out that night with nothing but a half-packed duffel bag and an old laptop. No tearful goodbyes, no second thoughts. Just the sound of the door clicking shut behind me, final and absolute. The next few years were a blur of struggle and stubborn determination. I coded late into the night in dingy apartments, lived off instant ramen, and worked freelance gigs to fund my startup idea. A software platform for small businesses that needed custom solutions without the enterprise price tag. I lived like a ghost, driven by something more primal than ambition, something rooted in the need to prove them wrong. There were countless nights I thought about giving up. When potential investors ghosted me, when my bank account dipped below zero, when the loneliness hit harder than any failure. But I couldn't quit. Not when quitting would mean they were right. 3 years later, CodeWave landed its first big client, a national retail chain, and everything changed. Contracts poured in, and investors finally took notice. By 27, I was CEO of a company worth millions. I lived in a sleek downtown condo, drove a car that practically glided over the pavement, and wore tailored suits that cost more than my old apartment's rent. But success couldn't erase the past. Not really. My parents never called. Not when Forbes named me tech visionary to watch. Not when CodeWave hit 8-figure revenue. Not even when I moved back to Cleveland, setting up CodeWave's headquarters in the same city they still lived in. I told myself I didn't care. Then, out of the blue, the email came. Subject * urgent, family matter. From * dad. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening despite myself. 8 years of silence, shattered by 2 impersonal lines. "Liam, we need to talk. It's about Nathan." I should have deleted it, should have ignored it. But some part of me, some stubborn, bitter child still yearning for answers, clicked reply. "When and where?" "We met at an old diner on the west side of the city. The same place where I used to scrounge together coins for coffee while building my company." The place hadn't changed, same flickering neon sign, same sticky booths, but my parents looked different, smaller. My father's shoulders, once stiff with authority, now slumped. My mother's perfectly styled hair couldn't hide the weariness etched into her face. "Liam," my father greeted stiffly, rising from the booth as though expecting a handshake. I didn't move. He sat back down, clearing his throat. "Thank you for coming." I remained silent, letting them squirm in the awkwardness they'd created. "It's about your brother," my mother finally said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Of course, it was always about Nate. "He lost his job," my father confessed, glancing down at his coffee cup. "Corporate restructuring. They let him go months ago." I raised an eyebrow. "And you're telling me this because?" "He's been applying everywhere," my mother added quickly. "But the job market is difficult." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. They hadn't reached out for 8 years. Not when I was scraping by, not when I succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. But now that their precious son had fallen from grace, suddenly I was worth contacting. "You want me to hire him?" I said flatly. "Just until he gets back on his feet," my father pleaded. "You have connections." The audacity hit like a gut punch. After everything, after being cast aside, this was what they wanted. A lifeline for Nate? I leaned back, folding my arms. "Tell me something. Do you even know what my company does?" They exchanged a confused glance, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never expected from them. Uncertainty. Vulnerability. Software. My mother ventured hesitantly. "Something technical." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "Custom enterprise platforms for mid-size corporations. We don't hand out jobs." "You don't have to be cruel, Liam," my father snapped, anger flashing in his eyes. "Cruel," I shot back. "You disowned me, cut me off without a second thought. Now you need something, and I'm the cruel one." My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or frustration that I wasn't falling in line. "We made mistakes," she admitted quietly. "But this isn't about the past. It's about helping family." That word hit harder than it should have. Family. I exhaled sharply, rising from the booth. "Tell Nate to send his resume, like everyone else." Before they could respond, I walked out into the cold night air, leaving behind the family that had abandoned me. Again. The following Monday, Nate's resume landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Application for Senior Business Development Role, Nathan Collins." I stared at it for a long moment, fingers resting on the mouse. His resume was exactly what I expected. Polished, precise, practically perfect. Decade-long career, Ivy League credentials, glowing references from CEOs and board members. Every line screamed competence, success, and entitlement. My first instinct was to hit delete. Hiring Nate would mean inviting them back into my life, reopening wounds I'd worked hard to forget. But another part of me, the darker, pettier side, wanted to see how far he'd fallen. Was he desperate enough to swallow his pride and work for me? Before I could talk myself out of it, I forwarded the resume to HR. "Schedule an interview." 3 days later, Rebecca, my assistant, poked her head into my office. "HR has Nathan Collins booked for a 3 p.m. interview Friday. Should I sit in or?" "No," I said quickly, then reconsidered. "Actually, have them send him directly to me." Rebecca blinked but nodded. Understood. I hadn't planned to be involved, but curiosity won out. I needed to see for myself what kind of man Nate had become, and whether he'd even dare to show up. Friday came faster than I expected. I just finished a meeting with our product team when Rebecca buzzed my office phone. "Mr. Collins is here early." My chest tightened, though I wasn't sure if it was anger or anticipation. "Send him in." The door opened, and there he was. Nate walked in wearing a sharp navy suit, his leather briefcase swinging confidently at his side. He hadn't changed much. Still tall, still well-groomed, still radiating that self-assured arrogance I'd hated growing up. But there was something new, too. His eyes looked tired, worn down in a way that no tailored suit could hide. "Liam," he greeted with a strained smile. "It's good to see you." I stayed seated, fingers steepled on the desk. "Nathan." He shifted awkwardly, clearly expecting some gesture of familiarity. A handshake, maybe even a hug. I gave him nothing. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, regaining his composure. "I appreciate the opportunity." I let the silence stretch, watching him squirm just enough. "Why are you applying here?" He cleared his throat. "I believe my experience in corporate strategy and enterprise partnerships would be valuable to CodeWave. I've managed multi-million-dollar portfolios, led expansion efforts." "Spare me the pitch," I interrupted coldly. "We both know you're here because our parents begged me to give you a shot." His jaw tightened, his polite mask slipping for a split second. They might have suggested reaching out, but this application was my decision. I raised an eyebrow. "So you're not here out of desperation?" His silence spoke volumes. I leaned back, studying him. You're used to being at the top. Fancy titles, private offices, executive perks. You won't find that here. I'm not asking for handouts, he snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. I just need a chance. Something about the crack in his voice made me pause. Maybe he was desperate. I exhaled slowly. 60-day probation. No guarantees, no special treatment. You report directly to me. His eyes widened. Seriously. Dead serious. I held his gaze, daring him to back down. For the first time in our lives, Nate didn't argue. He extended his hand. Thank you. I ignored the hand. Show up Monday. Don't be late. The first month was brutal. For both of us. I threw Nate into one of our toughest accounts. A logistics firm notorious for impossible demands and chaotic projects. I expected him to crack, to come crawling back, begging for something easier. But he didn't. He negotiated deals that even I hadn't managed to close. He stayed late, worked weekends, and fought for every client like his life depended on it. The Nate I remembered, the cocky, entitled golden boy, was nowhere to be found. Late one evening, long after the office had emptied, I saw his light still on. Curious, I wandered over. His office door was ajar, and he sat hunched over his laptop, tie loosened, face drawn with exhaustion. For a moment I considered walking away, but something about the way he rubbed his temples, staring blankly at his phone, stopped me. Late for a call? I asked from the doorway. He jumped, quickly pocketing his phone. Just thinking. I leaned against the doorframe. Something on your mind? He hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing that matters. I should have left it at that, but against my better judgment I pressed. Why'd you really lose your job? His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. I screwed up, he admitted quietly. Made a bad call. Approved a merger without full board approval. The deal collapsed, and they pinned it on me. He exhaled shakily. I thought I was untouchable. For a moment, I saw past the polished facade, the man beneath the perfect resume, flawed and human. Welcome to the real world, I said, softer than I intended. He managed a bitter smile. Yeah. We stood in uncomfortable silence until his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, expression darkening before he silenced the call. The contact name flashed briefly before the screen went dark. Mom. Still playing the perfect son, huh? I said, bitterness creeping back in. His face twisted, something raw flashing in his eyes. You wouldn't understand. Before I could respond, Rebecca appeared with urgent news. A major client was threatening to walk. Duty called, but for the first time, I wondered if maybe Nate's fall from grace had cost him more than just a job. Maybe, just maybe, he was fighting to survive. The same way I had all those years ago. 2 more months passed, and despite my best efforts to keep things strictly professional, I couldn't deny it anymore. Nate was good. His probation period ended with record-breaking client wins and successful expansions into international markets I thought were out of reach. But that wasn't what stuck with me. It was the smaller moments, the way he stayed late without complaint, helped new team members without being asked, and never tried to charm his way out of tough assignments. He wasn't the Nate I remembered. Still, old habits die hard. Every time I saw his name on the quarterly reports, something twisted in my chest. A tangled mix of pride, resentment, and suspicion. Was he really trying to build something here, or was this just another stepping stone for him? Then came the industry gala, the kind of high-stakes event where reputations are made and fortunes sealed. As CEO, I couldn't skip it, and with his track record, neither could Nate. The venue was a sprawling downtown ballroom, all glass chandeliers and polished marble. We'd barely stepped inside when Nate disappeared into the crowd, navigating the room like he'd never lost his executive sheen. I forced myself to focus on the reason we were there, securing a major partnership with an international software giant. Halfway through the evening, while finalizing a deal, I spotted them. My parents. They stood near the champagne bar, perfectly composed, their practiced social smiles on full display. I hadn't seen them in person since that awful meeting at the diner. Seeing them now, blending seamlessly into the elite crowd, sent a chill down my spine. Before I could slip away, my mother's gaze locked on mine. Her face lit up with calculated warmth, and she grabbed my father's arm, steering him toward me like they'd just run into an old friend. I cursed under my breath but held my ground. "Liam!" my mother exclaimed, arms outstretched as if expecting a hug. I didn't move. "Mom! Dad!" My voice was flat. My father gave a stiff nod, his eyes already scanning the room for someone more useful. "We had no idea you'd be here," my mother gushed. "Isn't this marvelous?" I stayed silent, letting the awkwardness settle. "Codewave is doing well, I hear," my father said curtly, his voice tinged with something almost like respect. It made my skin crawl. Before I could respond, Nate appeared beside me, holding 2 drinks. He froze when he saw them. His face hardened for a split second, then smoothed into polite indifference. "Nathan!" my mother cooed, switching gears instantly. "We've missed you." Nate handed me a glass without a word. His fingers trembled slightly, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. "We've been meaning to talk," my father added. "About family matters." There it was, the real reason they were here. They didn't care about me or Nate. They cared about controlling the narrative, about clawing back into the lives they'd abandoned when we stopped being useful. Nate's jaw clenched. "There's nothing to discuss." My mother's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. "Nathan, please." No, his voice was cold, steady. "I'm done pretending. You only reach out when you need something. You can't manipulate me anymore." Her face twisted with indignation, but before she could speak, I stepped in. "He's right," I said firmly. "We're done." For the first time, they looked truly stunned, as if they'd never imagined losing control over both of us. Without another word, we turned and walked away, leaving them frozen in place. Later that night, after the event wound down, Nate and I found ourselves sitting outside the venue on a quiet bench overlooking the city skyline. Neither of us spoke for a while, the distant hum of traffic filling the silence. "They'll never change," he said eventually, staring out at the horizon. "No," I agreed. "They won't." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I used to think if I succeeded enough, if I did everything right, they'd finally see me. Not just as some perfect son, but as me." I nodded slowly. "I thought if I built something big enough, they'd regret pushing me away." We sat in silence, the weight of old wounds hanging between us. "I'm staying," Nate said quietly. "At Codewave, if you'll have me." I glanced over, startled. "You could go anywhere. You've proven that." "Maybe I don't want to go anywhere," he admitted. "For the first time, it feels like I'm doing something that matters. Not for them. For me." Something loosened in my chest. Something I hadn't realized I'd been holding on to for years. "I could use someone who doesn't quit when things get tough," I said. "But don't expect special treatment." He laughed. A real, genuine laugh. "Wouldn't dream of it, boss." We stayed there a while longer, 2 brothers finally on equal ground. Not because of our parents or past mistakes, but because we'd chosen to be. A week later, as I cleared out old files in my office, I found a small, worn envelope tucked inside a forgotten drawer. The handwriting on the back was unmistakable, my mother's. "Our boys forever proud." For the first time, I didn't feel anger. Just acceptance. Some stories don't get perfect endings. But maybe, just maybe, this one was finally heading toward something better.